The Fourth Way by P D Ouspensky, Chapter 8. We must speak about man's place in the world, because from now onwards we must always study man in connection with his place. Since there are many things about us, about what is possible for us and what is impossible, that are connected with this. In the first lecture I said that we must study man, and parallel with that we must study the world in which man lives, in order to try and understand why man is what he is, and why he cannot be any different. We cannot find answers to all these questions if we study man separately from the world in which he lives. In a certain sense, man is analogous to the universe. The same laws operate in him, and we shall find that it is easier to understand some of these laws by studying man, while other laws we can understand better by studying the universe. But first of all we must realize the limitations of our perception and our thinking power. So this study also includes the study of our limitations. The system enlarges our knowledge very much, but it cannot do miracles. If we try to think of the world apart from ourselves and to see it as it is, even from the physical point of view with the help of the telescope or the microscope, we shall realize how limited our capacities of perception are, for they are limited by size. And our capacity for mental seeing is infinitely more limited. Even if we were to come in contact with the source of full knowledge, such as we are, we would not be able to take it or use it, for although we can know more than we ordinarily know, there is a definite limit in us, in our mind. So we must know all our limitations, and then, when we know the power of our instrument, we shall know what we can get. The first idea of this system is that, to a certain extent, we can improve this instrument for acquiring knowledge. This is the idea of self-improvement. If you remember, I said that from the point of view of this system, only knowledge of the whole can be regarded as knowledge, for knowledge of a part without its relation to the whole is not knowledge, but ignorance. We can have this knowledge, only we do not realize it and do not understand that in relation to everything, knowledge begins with knowledge of the whole. Take, for instance, this box of matches. If I look at it through a narrow slit, I shall only see a small part of it, and shall never get the idea of the box of matches as a whole. It is the same with everything. Almost all we call knowledge is not really knowledge at all, because it is merely knowledge of a small part without knowing the place of this part in the whole. There is a certain book of aphorisms which says, "To know means to know all. To know a part of something means not to know." It is not difficult to know all, because in order to know all, one has to know very little. But in order to know this little, one has to know pretty much. So we have to start with pretty much, with the idea of coming to this very little, which is necessary for the knowledge of all. Knowledge of all is possible with the use of two principles, the principle of relativity and the principle of scale. If we speak about the world, it is necessary to know all about the world, and we can know all we need to know about it if we take things on different scales. We can know much more than we know ordinarily if we study things commensurable with us and having a relation to us on one scale, and things which are further removed from us and which have no definite relation to us on another, a smaller scale in a more abstract way. In this way we can get all the necessary amount of knowledge without learning too much, and this knowledge will include very few useless things, because if we learn everything indiscriminately, we will not know the necessary things. For instance, you know your own house on a scale proportionate to your body, but the town in which you live you know on a much smaller scale. Some parts you know well, other parts not so well, but there is no part of it you know as well as your own house. And England you know on a still smaller scale, or Europe on a smaller scale still, and so on. Now I shall remind you of what I said in the first lecture concerning the study of the world and the two fundamental laws that govern it, and shall point out what you must remember and how you must remember it. These universal laws are really beyond our mind, so with all the wish to study them, you will not understand much more than words. But even this is useful. With the help of these words you can reconstruct your views of the universe and put man in the right place in relation to different worlds. The first thing to remember is what was said about the law of three, that everything in the world, all manifestations of energy, all kinds of action, whether in the world or in human activity, whether internal or external, are always manifestations of three forces which exist in nature. These forces are called active, passive and neutralizing, or first, second and third. It must be understood that they do not differ from one another as activity and passivity differ in our ordinary understanding of these terms. Active and passive forces are both active, for a force cannot be passive. But there is a certain difference in their activity, and this difference makes all the variety of phenomena that exist in the world. The three forces work together, but one of them predominates in each combination. At the same time, each new force which is now active can become passive or neutralized in the next moment in another triad. When three forces meet together, things happen. If they do not come together, nothing happens. From this point of view, matter must also have certain definite denominations according to which force works through it, whether it is organic or inorganic, a chemical element or a compound. When active force passes through any kind of matter, it is called carbon. When passive force passes through it, it is called oxygen. When neutralizing force works through it, it is called nitrogen. And when matter is taken without relation to the force that works through it, it is called hydrogen. At first, these names should be taken simply as labels. Thus, the law of three brings relativity into our definition of matter. For instead of one iron, we have 4 irons. Instead of 1 copper, 4 coppers, and so on. Father, mother, son. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. The family is hydrogen. The beginning of a new family is the sun. In ordinary thinking, we realize the existence of 2 forces, action and resistance, positive and negative electricity, and so on. But in this state of consciousness, we do not see that 3 forces are always present in every event, in every phenomenon, and that only a conjunction of 3 forces can produce an event. 2 forces cannot produce anything. They will only turn round one another without any result. It takes a long time to begin to see 3 forces in things. For some reason, we are 3 force blind, although we can observe it in many chemical reactions and biological phenomena. Even when we fully understand that nothing can happen without the presence of all the 3 elements in relation to ourselves, we are inclined to forget or disregard it. We do not fully observe even 2 forces and generally expect things to happen when only 1 force is present. Later you will see that if you want to produce a certain effect or a certain action and 1 force is missing, you can get no result. In some cases it may be passive force and then nothing happens, for if there is no passive force, there is no material. In another case, active or neutralizing force may be missing, and so again you can do nothing. If you try to find manifestations of the first and second forces, sometimes you can find manifestations of the third. It needs observation and it cannot be proven except by yourselves. In psychology, many things can be explained by the necessity of the third force. This also explains why we cannot bring the third force. And without the third force, no action can happen, or it happens in a different way from the way we meant it to happen. Sometimes we see the neutralizing force, only we are mistaken about its nature. For instance, we often see it as result when in reality it exists before the first and the second. We make many mistakes about 3 forces, but it is very useful to think about it. Question: are the 3 forces external, outside of oneself? Answer: they are in yourself and outside yourself, on our scale, on planetary scale, on universal scale, on all scales. Question: could you give us an example of how they work? Answer: suppose you want to study something. You have some material, new ideas and so on, but at the same time you have a resistance to this study because some eyes want it and some other eyes do not want it. They represent active and passive forces. Suppose that this study produces some kind of emotion in you. This emotion works as neutralizing force and then you can study. If emotion does not come, Those eyes that want it and those that do not want it will continue to argue and nothing will happen. The law of three explains many things that cannot be explained in the ordinary way, because we usually think about only one force. Very seldom do we take the second force, resistance, into consideration, and never the third force. Yet in any calculation of actions it is necessary to take three forces into account. Question. Is necessity the third force? So many decisions seem to be settled by necessity. Answer. And many others are settled by what is not necessary. People can always do without necessary things, but to do without unnecessary things is much more difficult. So you cannot say that, but you must realize that you cannot speak about the third force without giving the first and the second. Question. Can we study the law of three to see why our efforts do not succeed? Answer. Very useful sometimes. Sometimes you can see that because of not knowing and not complying with the law of three, people lose all the results of their efforts. Either they do not calculate resistance or they do not calculate their active force. I'm speaking now about a triad where the third force is present. Very strange phenomena happen when the difference between forces is too big. The result appears completely unlike what was expected. Suppose you want to do a certain thing, but you did not calculate resistance. Your intention meets with very strong resistance, and the result, when it comes, is absolutely different from what is wanted. In the work, you can see two forces, the ideas of the system and your own resistance, your own sleep. In each particular case, a certain third force enters and either helps one side or another side. Question. What is the practical value of studying forces? Answer. Because behind all things there are cosmic laws. You cannot understand why things happen in one way or another unless you have some idea of these laws. Question. If you take events instead of matter, can you say that they are of a different kind according to the force that works through them? Answer. They are different according to which triad works. For instance, we all know how the same sentence, the same words, can have quite a different meaning according to who says it. Or even the same person can say the same words at different times and the meaning will be different. We can find the teaching about three forces or three gunas in Sankhya philosophy, but in the existing literature it has seriously deteriorated, for they speak of each guna or force as remaining always the same, whereas from the point of view of the system, as I said, the activity, passivity or neutralizing power of each force appears only in relation to the two other forces. There can be 7 combinations of forces, one of them incomprehensible to the human mind, since in this triad each force occupies each place. Triads refer to events, so if we speak of each event separately, whether big or small, we have to understand to which triad each of them belongs. But a succession of events proceeds according to the law of 7, or the law of octaves. The law of 7 must be understood and remembered from the point of view of intervals. Putting it briefly, the law of 7 means that no force ever works continuously in the same direction. It works for a certain time, then diminishes in intensity, and either changes its direction or undergoes an inner change. In every octave, that is a period between a certain number of vibrations and even double or half that number, there are 2 places where vibrations, or to be more exact, manifestations of energy going on in space or time, or in both, undergo a certain change, slow down and then start again. If an additional shock does not enter at those places, the octave changes direction. This measured irregularity in the rate of vibrations was calculated and embodied in a certain formula. This formula, expressing a cosmic law, was later applied to music in the form of the major scale. The law of 7 shows that no force can develop in one direction and shows the places where these changes or retardations occur. Question. Is it because of obstacles at intervals? Answer. It is because of intervals. Obstacles are normal. Every energy develops among obstacles. Question. Does the line always change in one direction? Answer. No, in any direction. When things happen, one can never be sure of direction. Men 1, 2 and 3 never arrive where they want to. It can only happen by accident. We think that when we do not arrive where we want to, it is an exception. We do not realize that it is a law. We cannot rely on chance to provide the right shocks at the right moments. Question: is this process infinite? Answer: you cannot imagine a force that works indefinitely. It works according to the amount of energy there is. But again, octaves are different. They may be descending or ascending. An ascending octave is between a certain number of vibrations and double that number. A descending octave is between a certain number of vibrations and half that number. So speaking about a succession of events, we have to know ascending and descending octaves. Without knowing whether it is a descending or an ascending octave, it is impossible to understand it. And this is what happens in ordinary thinking, because people study ascending octaves and take them for descending and vice versa. Question: could you give an example of people taking a descending octave for an ascending one? Answer: suppose we meet savages. We usually think that they are primitive, and from these primitive people they begin to develop civilization and culture. But we do not realize that in most cases they are descendants of cultured people. Very often we take degeneration for evolution. It is easiest to observe the law of 7 in human actions. You can see how when people begin to do something, study, work, after some time, without any visible reason, their efforts diminish. Work slows down, and if some special effort is not made at a given moment, the line changes its direction. There is a small but real change in inner strength. Then, after some time, there is again a slackening, and again, if there is no special effort, the direction changes. It can change completely and go in a diametrically opposite direction, still appearing to be the same thing. There are many phases of human activity which answer to this description. They start one way and then imperceptibly continue in exactly the opposite way. If these intervals are known, and if a method of creating some special effort or arrangement is used in these intervals, it is possible to avoid breaks in the octave. Everything goes by octaves. No vibration, no movement, no activity can go in any other way. Scales vary, so we cannot follow them, but we can see their results, the results of the law of 7. Even the inner physical work of the organism is under this law. With certain kinds of efforts we can produce these missing semitones, fill the intervals, and in this way change the work for our machine. For instance, you will see later how the effort to remember oneself changes many things in the chemistry of our organism. Question: if you discover an interval in a certain action, is it likely to go on repeating? Answer: if you could find examples, it would be easier to talk. To answer generally, if nothing is done, the interval will increase with each octave at the same place. Question: you spoke about octaves of self-remembering. Answer: not exactly. I said that if you work, your work may form itself into octaves and will have intervals. If you do not know where the intervals come, your work will change. But we cannot speak of octaves in relation to self-remembering, because with us it only starts and peters out. If we manage 2 or 3 notes, it will be good. We have not got enough initial energy, yet we must start and start again until we make an octave. We have to begin afresh every day. Do, re, mi. For a long time we can get no further than mi. Question: if you get to mi, what happens? Answer: then you stop and go back. For a long time you will not pass the interval, but after some time of study you will be able to detect intervals. You will know that in some part of your line of work an interval is approaching. Question: to see octaves, ought one try to follow a sequence of happenings in oneself? Answer: not a sequence of happenings, but you can see intervals if you begin to do something, to learn something. You will see how an activity goes on for some time in a particular direction and then deviates from the original course.